thank you. Thank you, Bev and Barry and Program Committee for inviting me, including that. This is very interesting. And let me begin by saying I don't know very much about Europe. I know where it is, fly there every once in a while. I know a lot more about America. So I'll talk about America and I'll come back to Europe. I think there is a lesson. American history does hold some lessons for what Europe is going through now, but they're kind of a little more subtle, perhaps, than the way we usually think about it. I want to make 4 points today. National government was never big enough to actually have a transfer union until 1933, and when it created a transfer union. And so it wasn't, and I'll talk about why this was. It wasn't that it didn't have state capacity. It was just politically very difficult for the national government to do very much, and it did not become large until 1933. The second point is that we don't understand kind of colonial and revolutionary finance very well, either in monetary or fiscal terms, and as a result, what the Hamiltonian moment meant is kind of unclear. And I'm not an expert on this. Dick knows much more about Hamilton than I do. But as you'll see, I think there's some reasons to wonder whether what happens with the Hamiltonian finance is in fact giving us the lesson that we think it is. Third is that there is a no bailout provision. It's an agreement that the national government, after assuming the state debts in 1792, has never assumed any state debts. But really, that this should be interpreted as a no transfer union provision that was finally abrogated in 1933 and switched. And again, it was a political equilibrium, not a constitutional equilibrium, not an institutional equilibrium. And there is a lesson to learn finally, and that is that what works in America is to have rules for the central government and discretion on the part of the peripheral government. And as we'll see, I think that in the current crisis, that's exactly the opposite of how it's worked in Europe. The EU and the Eurozone have tried to impose rules on the peripheral governments and to maintain discretion at the center. And that's probably, in the long term, going to lead to serious problems. Or maybe even in the short term. Okay, so fiscal capacity in some sense. The following graph is just the share of national government revenues as a share of GDP for decade intervals in the 19th century, and in census of government years in the 20th. I use revenues because they're a little bit smoother and I had them on my laptop. And basically the point here is that, I'll come back to the microphone in a minute, that here's a Civil War decade, national government revenues were very rarely more than 2% of GDP. 80% of government expenditures up until 1900 are for military and interest is just paying off the wars. Expenditures would spike a little bit more. We'd have the War of 1812, we'd have the Civil War. But basically, the national government fisc is quite small. And Dick will say it's bigger than the state fisc. That's true. States don't actually collect that much money, although they do some interesting things. But in 1900, local governments were double the size of national governments in terms of aggregate. We just did a lot of stuff at the local level. So to have a transfer union was going to be tough. But in the 30s, the national government began to devote substantial resources to social welfare programs, and I'll talk about those in a few minutes. But it's just not, when we think about the Hamiltonian moment, yeah, they did refinance some of this debt, and you could have capitalized national revenues and raised a lot of money, but that was going to be politically really hard to do. Okay? So we don't want to think about the national government as sitting there running a transfer union from 1792 on. It just didn't. And then I realized that I needed to understand what fiscal unions were. This was in the Christmas issue of The Economist that had something on the Holy Roman Empire. And where history leaves EU leaders today is debatable. Faced with a similar crisis in the 1780s, a different confederation seized on the Hamiltonian moment, assumed the debts of its member states, and had a good run as the United States. The Holy Roman Empire, by contrast, had settled on a looser structure without a transfer union, though fading by then. It had been around much longer. This kind of struck me because when I think about fiscal unions, I never ever thought about transfers, particularly as being an automatic aspect of them. I just thought this is the fiscal structure, who taxes what, who spends for what, how things get allocated and shared as opposed to this automatic sharing. So I'm still not exactly clear when we say fiscal union. Some of you may hear transfer union, some of you may not. And we may want to discuss that, what a fiscal union should mean in the European context. Second point about the Hamiltonian moment, it's really not clear that the national government bailed out the states in 1792. Okay, we have a tradition in American history, partly in American economic history, of thinking about the dysfunctional financial structure during the Revolution, because the national government did not levy any taxes. It had to make requisitions from the states, and that this didn't work very well, so they went bankrupt. The problem, and that in fact did happen, but the revenue system of the Revolution was more complicated. Colonies had, before the Revolution, used a method of currency finance, which I really didn't understand until a couple of months ago. Dick and I have run across this about burned money as an expenditure for a state. And many of the colonies they didn't have a lot of specie, so they would issue notes payable for taxes and then commit to burn them when they received them. Of course, this gets mixed up in this notion of inflationary colonial finance. They're printing up too much money and depreciating their currency. But in fact, it was a credible commitment in most colonies to actually do this. And this is exactly how the continental dollar starts at the beginning of the war. They're redeemable in gold in a certain interval. And of the $200 million that were issued in the continental currency, roughly $150 million was retired by the states through tax collections at the state level. So the states would send the money to the Continental Congress, and the Continental Congress would burn it. So they were heavily involved in financing the war effort through currency. And they were also had acquired much of the national bonds that were outstanding. The debt was kind of a mixture of bonds and other obligations. So James Ferguson, or E. James Ferguson, who's kind of the preeminent historian of colonial finance, says that by 1789, most of the debt of the national government had already been retired by the states, and had the system was in place, continued for a few more years, the most pressing problem of the Confederation would have been solved without changing the system. There were people, Alexander Hamilton among them, who were interested in having a national level debt that the states would not be responsible for, and therefore having more fiscal capacity at the national level. But it's not entirely clear then that the system was completely bankrupt, that the federal government was not paying off some of its debts. Massachusetts and Georgia were in fiscal trouble, but lots of states weren't. They were collecting enough money to pay off. They were actually retiring the currency. They were holding the debt. So Ferguson looked at Maryland. After Hamilton's refinancing program, he issued national bonds, and he, in exchange for existing national bonds and state bonds, and half the money that in Maryland, the transfer books aren't complete, many were burned, but half of the bonds that were returned to the national government in Maryland were bonds owned by the state of Maryland. So the states had built up large amounts of this. In fact, they had been paying interest through something called indents. So national government bonds that were the national government was not paying interest on, the states were. So the Hamiltonian bargain created a fiscal union, but it wasn't the case that the states were completely falling apart and the national government comes in and bails them out. I hate that word bailout because it gets used so indiscriminately. But in fact, what it was the creation of a stronger center. And that bargain created a fiscal union, but it was a fiscal union which was politically incapable of being a transfer union. The states did not want to create a national government which was going to move lots of money around. You know, it was stronger than the Confederation, and they did give it the power to tax, and they gave it the power to do certain kinds of things. Whether they actually designed it this way or not isn't clear to me, but they did not produce a transfer union. And it's not even clear, because there had been this continuous negotiation between the states and the national, amongst the states themselves about how they were going to pay for the revolution. Hamilton did not sweep down out of a chariot from the sky with his plan. The states had been negotiating who was going to bear what costs all along. And you know, Hamilton was definitely the guy who was there when they put it into place. So I think there's some issues there about how we think about the federal dynamics in the constitutional period. The second historical episode that's already been mentioned today is in 1841 and 1842, 8 states in the territory of Florida default on their debts, 5 of them repudiate. And there's this notion that when the national government does not come in to bail them out, that this establishes this no bailout provision, and that's a very important historical antecedent. Bob Inman actually has a paper who makes a particularly strong case that maybe the states borrowed too much money because they thought they would be bailed out. And a congressman from my state, Maryland, actually proposed a bailout scheme. There is, however, and believe me, I've read a lot of stuff about the states borrowing and how they financed it and what they were doing, and I have not found any evidence that any state borrowed money thinking they were going to be paid, that they were going to get bailed out. That was just not in the cards. Nobody was thinking that. And as soon as this guy, William Cross Johnson, puts his proposal before the Senate Finance Committee, says, this is crazy. I mean, it was not viable. It was proposed, and there were people who talked about it, and there were definitely newspaper reports and things like that about it. But there wasn't really any probability this was going to happen. And I really think rather than a no bailout provision, is that there was a no transfer provision. The federal government had been asked repeatedly before 1840 to help states, like New York went and said, we'd like to build this Erie Canal. A lot of the benefits are going to go to Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Will you come up with some money? And the national government always refused. It tried. Congress debated this over and over and over again. How can we create a fund of money that the states can use for improving transportation? Henry Clay was famous for this, but they never could do it. And even when Congress passed bills allocating mostly revenue from land sales divided amongst the states on the basis of population or congressional representation, then the presidents vetoed the bills. So they could never get a transfer program in which federal money was regularly spent at the state level. And the forces here were political, not institutional. Although Madison would say it was unconstitutional to give money to build canals, Madison had signed laws which gave money to build water improvements. So it was really a political equilibrium, not an institutional one. And I wrote this, Americans feared and opposed a strong national government. They were worried about it from the Revolutionary period and kind of the way they interpreted the events that led up to the Revolution. And there were people who wanted a stronger national government, Hamilton among them, Clay among them. And they were political leaders, and they clearly were important players in the political system, but they were never able to get, despite lots of proposals, any significant amount of fiscal involvement on the national level in the promotion of economic development. Small things, yeah, rivers and harbors, something where every state could get a project, 10,000 here, 10,000 there. Unfortunately, 10,000 doesn't add up to a lot of money. States spent probably 9 to 10 times what the national government spent on transportation improvements. States were much more involved in banking than the national government was. And these were live issues at the states. I mean, they were actively debating this. How involved should the political system be in promoting economic development? It just didn't, the national government was not able to come to an agreement for exactly the same reasons in Europe today. Everybody's got to agree on a plan that's going to treat, the entire country, and nobody wants to vote for a plan that's going to benefit one group and not another group. And so this brings me to my last point, and I think what the general overall lesson from American history is for the current European crisis is that both Congress and presidents were reluctant to expand the role of the national government except for military defense. And of course we had a civil war. We need to all remember that when we talk about the benefits of the American system. It blew up. It wasn't able to keep everybody on the same page. And those account for about 80% of all national expenditures. So there's not a significantly large, there's not a pool of money the national government is spending here. And this limited size of the national government was a political rather than a constitutional outcome, although we tend to think about balanced government and checks and balances and maintaining limited government. You didn't have to change the Constitution to quadruple the size of the national government. Those powers were always there. I mean, but there was an intense cultural and political debate about how big it should be. So what happened was when the national government actually did things, and it's hard to measure this in terms of expenditures and stuff, what metric we should use, they largely did it through rule-based programs. Now what do I mean by that? Some of you are yours and some of you are not. It's from Austria. Won't get Social Security checks. But if you're getting a Social Security check, it doesn't matter where you lived when you made the money. It doesn't matter where you live when you get your check. You're going to get the same check. It's going to be determined by a formula based on how much money you made and when you made it. The welfare programs until the mid-90s were all matching grants. States got money, dollar for dollar, whatever, varied from program to program, depending on how much the state spent. Highway expenditures, which is really the longest running since 1916 national program for financing infrastructure, the matching rate is 9 to 1. So for every dollar the states spend, they get $9 of federal money, but it's all purely matched. And there's a formula that allocates the total amount of money amongst the states according to a formula. Basically, the formula today is exactly the same one as it was in 1916. It benefits places like Hawaii and Montana and not New York. But messing with the formula turns out to be politically impossible. So when you think about these programs, there is not very much discretion at the national level. That is, the national government potentially has the ability to do a lot of different kinds of things, but the stuff that's politically sustainable is rule-based. Why? Because you don't want to have these big debates over who's getting how much. So the major non-military expenditure in the 20th century has been for Social Security, health, and social welfare programs. In fact, that big jump up in the size of national expenditures was initially more than half driven by military expenditures, involvement in World War II, the Korean War. Basically, the national government from 1953 to 2008 was about 20% of GDP. Initially, about half of that was military. The military proportion has shrunk, and the welfare proportion has grown. But the welfare programs tend to be, again, rule-based. They're not discretionary. We debate about the rules a lot, but we debate what the rules should be. And so the common pattern in America is rules at the center, discretion at the periphery. This goes all the way back to the colonial currency and debt finance and the Revolution. Continental Congress spent the money, and they let the states figure out how they were going to raise the taxes to retire the currency, to retire the debt. They didn't tell them how they were going to do it, and the states didn't want to be told how they were going to be doing it. And this insistence on rules continued through the 19th century. I got lots of examples that you don't want me to talk about. And it became a central part of the New Deal. The New Deal was funded by the national government, New Deal programs, but it was administered by the states. In fact, more than 100% of the increase in federal government expenditures during the New Deal was in programs that were actually administered by the states, not by the national government. They spent the money, and the national government had to follow the rules. Now, if you think about this in a kind of public choice or even game theory sense, political economy sense, the dynamics of a federal system are very different when the center is constrained to follow rules. Even though they get to choose the rules, but they're constrained to follow them. Instead of a federal system in which the center makes unique deals with each of the subsidiary governments. One with Portugal, one with Spain, one with Ireland, one with Greece, one with Cyprus. Right? Because if you do that, then everybody is going to be game in the center. And the center is going to be game in everybody else. And the center is going to have this rolling coalition problem with how do we keep people happy? Well, we pay them off here, we pay them off there. And it's going to create an extremely difficult political economy problem. Now, we have lots of examples of places that have discretion at the center, like Argentina, or Brazil, or China. We don't, China's boom is partly caused by moving to more clear rules at the center for the allocation of funds. So federal systems with discretion at the center are probably better than a lot of really small governments, but they are not as efficient as federal systems where the center obeys the rules. And in the current crisis, and again, I don't know very much about Europe, but from the distance it appears that in fact Europe is following a policy in which they're maintaining discretion at the center, and they're attempting to impose rules on the periphery, and then when the periphery breaks the rules, they ignore it. Because why? Well, I'm Germany. I ran up a big deficit, sorry, okay? And then that means that nobody can figure out what the rules are going to be. Thanks a lot.
All right.